Hello. So I've been reading an interesting book. It's called Jung and the Story of Our Time. It's about Carl Jung, and it's by Lawrence Vanderpost. And I had to make this video because it's really made an impression on me. And I have noticed some things. You know, I'm kind of baffled that I haven't read it already, but yet at the same time, I'm really glad that I didn't. I'm glad that I first knew Thus Spoke Zarathustra before I read that book by Lawrence Vanderpost. It has been said that Vanderpost can write like the wind. He's a beautiful author, writer, storyteller. And indeed he is. I was very impressed by what I read. The way he talked about Carl Jung, whether it's entirely exaggerated or not, I'm not sure. But wow, what a story. And there are definitely some things that I have noticed, some comparisons between Carl Jung and Nietzsche. But in order to do this video and make my point, I think what I'd like to do is I'd like to divide up Nietzsche's entire work into, I want to like to oversimplify it into two categories. The first category is the lower category. I would call that the depth of what Nietzsche knew about humans, about life, about the world, about inside of us. What Nietzsche even called himself a psychologist, as well as a philosopher. But Nietzsche had profound insights into humanity. And so I'd like to separate that as the lower, and then there's the higher part of what Nietzsche talked about, which is, you can imagine him soaring into the sky, into the clouds, climbing a high mountain, reaching the summit after an exhausting climb up the mountain. This is the heights of Nietzsche's writing. So there's the depth of Nietzsche's writing, and there's the heights. And I, obviously, believe that both are very much present in Thus Spoke Zarathustra. Now, Carl Jung, and I've talked with a commenter on, who I appreciated very much on a previous video. I think his name is Nicholas. I appreciate his comments. I appreciate everyone's comments, others as well. And his comments really prompted me to look into it further. And then I read this book. And I discovered that essentially Carl Jung looked at Thus Spoke Zarathustra, and he was very much, at least at the time of life that he looked at it, at this particular time at least, he was really rather frightened by it. He was like, I think at one point, I think he looked at it as a sort of pathology to think that he or his race or people could fly that high up to the divine. And so what he did, what Carl Jung did after that, is he just settled into the lower aspects of Nietzsche's writing. That is, Nietzsche's profound understanding of human psychology and of humans in general, coupled with history and philosophy as well. And so Carl Jung looked at the heights to which Nietzsche soared, and he was like, that's frightening, can't do that. And Carl Jung did is he got into the depths that Nietzsche also explored. So he discarded the heights and went into solely the depths. Now, for Carl Jung, I think that was probably a wise move. I think for who he was and where he came from, and the things that he would do and the way he was acting as a psychoanalyst rather than a grand philosopher, as Nietzsche was, dealing with grand philosophical concepts. I think that was wise of Carl Jung to do that, for who he was. However, I have noticed something about Carl Jung's reception amongst religious people, just as the reception, of course, of Nietzsche, as I've discussed in a previous video, was among religious people. Both Nietzsche and both Jung were rejected, typically, by their religious contemporaries. As I mentioned, Nietzsche's contemporary German Protestants, a tradition that Nietzsche himself came from, very much, those who held on to their Protestantism would only embrace half of Zarathustra or parts of it and be terrified by others. So also Jung, who came from a Protestant background, just embraced, as I've mentioned, the lower half. And even, I think he even called it at one point, the heights to which Nietzsche was soaring in Zarathustra is demonic, which of course I view to be a unfair characterization, of course, an untrue characterization. But both of them, the depths, Carl Jung going to the depths of what Nietzsche went into, and then defining all Carl Jung's various ideas and categories, like archetypes, like the unconscious, like the shadow projection, all these different things. These are very valuable concepts that make sense of much of human psychology even to this day. Even if we wanted to get rid of them, we really would not be able to. And so even though Jung rejected the heights to which Nietzsche flew, he, with the help of Freud, who came before him, although eventually Freud, however insightful he was in very narrow categories, would prove himself to be a little bit of a madman in terms of his obsession with sex and his overestimation of sex as a primary motivator in almost everything. Freud and Jung helped pioneer psychological concepts that today we simply could not do without, because we cannot think of psychology without those concepts now. And so one way or another, one is forced to deal with Carl Jung, because one is forced to deal with the collective unconscious, the idea. One is forced to deal with archetypes. And quite paradoxically, I would argue that Nietzsche himself dealt with those. Although not in the categories or in the way, he didn't speak of them in the same way that Carl Jung would eventually speak of them. But the heights to which Nietzsche soared in Thus Spake Zarathustra spoke to, I think, the longing for freedom, the transcendence of humanity above all of our weaknesses, above our condition, is something that is beautiful and characteristic of Zarathustra, and the music speaks through that, I would say. There is much more music in Zarathustra than there is in, say, Carl Jung. Although, quite paradoxically, this book, Jung and the Story of Our Time, by Vanderpost, is just poetic beyond belief. Like, it's really beautiful. But only in Zarathustra do you get to this soaring heights of beauty. Where am I going with this? So I'm trying to put out the case that even though Jung discarded a huge part of Nietzsche's project, Jung and Nietzsche shared much of a commonality. And particularly, as I've discussed in a previous video, both of them shared the same perception of the Germans as not really wanting to be Christian. As I've mentioned, Nietzsche said that Germany would do well to become Europe's first unchristian nation, while Carl Jung very boldly, I was really shocked when I first read what he said about Germans being Christians. He was explicit, offensively explicit. He said, which I appreciate, I think that's a great thing, Jung said a German Christian is a contradiction in terms. He's basically saying it's not possible for a Christian or German to be a Christian. He said the God of the Germans is Wotan and not the Christian God. So Carl Jung's explicit dismissal of the possibility that a German can be an authentic Christian, well, that would be considered very offensive, but wow, does that ever ring true with me? As of course I've discussed before. But both Carl Jung and Nietzsche, this is where I'm going with this, they were both rejected by their Protestant contemporaries. Both of them, Nietzsche and Carl Jung, sons of Protestant pastors, both of them. Both of them. Incredible. Were rejected entirely by all their Protestant contemporaries, particularly those who insisted on holding on to the Protestantism, the form of their Protestantism that they came from. Now, but how did they deal with this rejection? Well, apparently, and I've just found this out, Carl Jung often requested to speak to theologians in the church, to share his ideas with them, to talk about archetypes, the archetypes of Christianity. So instead of talking about the moralizing of Christianity, which is one thing I respect about Jung, that he really put the moralizing aside, the judgmentalism that's typical amongst Protestants, he put that aside, just obviously as Nietzsche did. He focused entirely on the archetypes, and Carl Jung wanted to talk to people about the archetypes. And so he requested from churches to send their theologians to him so that they could talk about this. Because from Carl Jung's perspective, the churches were dying. You know, just as Nietzsche said, God is dead. And they were essentially empty shells, these churches. Carl Jung noticed, just as Nietzsche noticed. And so he felt, well, but Carl Jung said, well, he's still a Protestant. Just as Nietzsche also was a Protestant, really, in a sense. In a sense, he was a Protestant. Carl Jung was still a Protestant. He couldn't dispose of all the archetypes that of where he came from, of his Christianity, of his history. And so he would he would discard or push aside the moralizing of Christianity. You know, you're a sinner, believe in Jesus to go to heaven, so you don't go to the bad place, sort of thing, blah, blah, blah. He'd push that aside, and he would talk about the imagery, the symbolism, the lessons, the profundity in the Bible, the profundity in... interesting thing, he was talking about the Roman Catholic Church and Mary holding Jesus, and the Protestants point out, well, you're not supposed to worship Mary, blah, blah, blah. But Carl Jung talked about how this was actually a good move on the Catholics' part because Rome was typically over-patriarchal, which I've also talked about before. And so focusing on Mary was a way of bringing the divine feminine back into the equation that Rome had long, relegated to the side. And so he would do things like that. He wouldn't say like a street preacher, believe in Jesus for your sins or anything like that. He'd say, what's the deeper underlying psychological meaning of all these symbols in the Christian faith? What are the meanings of these archetypes? Story archetypes, story elements, symbols. And so what he wanted to do is, Carl Jung realized, hey, the gig is kind of up with these churches. They're emptying fast. And indeed, what one author called the demon of unrest was spreading across the world, this post-Christian unrest, which ultimately led to the world wars. Carl Jung could feel that as it was happening before the wars, and then he obviously saw the rise of the Third Reich and the disaster of the world wars. But he could feel that, but he couldn't. He had this overwhelming sense that in Christianity itself, in the religions themselves, there was still, even though the people were insincere and really screwed up, there was still profundity, there was still some profound symbols in the religion. And so he would request for theologians or young pastors or whatever to come talk to him. But he was always rejected. And even when one pastor seemed very enthusiastic for a while, that pastor eventually turned on him as well. But Jung persisted in that. And Jung had a pretty thick skin, but I think, I've been thinking about it, and this gets to the point of this video, which I'm actually ultimately getting to, which is that Nietzsche, so Jung basically discarded Zarathustra for a while. Obviously, he looked into it a while, and he was quite impressed. But then he discarded it. But in a sense, quite paradoxically, Carl Jung would have done better if I think he had taken Nietzsche's advice. That there's this crazy paradox with the religious people. With Christians and Christianity, there's this crazy paradox, which is that the Christians themselves, particularly Protestants, and particularly German Protestants, you know, those types who are pretending to be Christian but who are not, are sometimes the people in Christianity, in Protestantism, can be the absolute worst. Just terrible people, bigoted, just horrible, really, really horrible. And yet, there can be symbols and truth within the religion that they claim to follow. But Nietzsche, in Zarathustra, he advised, let these walking tombs of death walk by, and do not, don't pick a fight with them. Don't deal with them. He says, if they want to go to eternal life, one should encourage them to go to eternal life. In other words, to die. He wasn't advocating for violence of any type. But, Nietzsche saw in the wish for eternal life in Protestantism, like after death, the wish for that, as nihilistic. And Nietzsche was like, don't interrupt them in that wish. Let them go. Let them just fade off into oblivion. Don't try to convince them of anything. Don't be like Carl Jung and call up a pastor or theologian and come over and let's talk about this. Let's look at the Bible differently. For Nietzsche, who's like, you shouldn't do that. That's hopeless. But for Carl Jung, he's like, well, no, we must do this. But Nietzsche, so paradoxically, this is the extreme paradox of it all, is that I personally think, this is the conclusion I've come to, Carl Jung was very much right to extract from the Bible, to extract from religion, the stories, the symbols, the meaning, and to think of them in new ways in terms of psychological categories and stuff like that. I think he was right to do that. Yet, on the other hand, he was extremely naive in assuming the best of these Protestants, that they'd want to do that, go there with him, that they'd be interested in looking at their own faith in a new way. Nietzsche would have laughed at him, I think, and his desire to do that. He would have been like, what are you thinking? What's wrong with you? No, of course they don't want to do that. Of course. But yet, Nietzsche himself never articulated these concepts, at least in the categories. He did articulate these concepts, but he didn't articulate Carl Jung's ideas with the words and the categories that Carl Jung did. So, in a sense, I see Nietzsche's Zarathustra as much more heroic, much more, brave and flying to the sky, climbing a mountain, a glorious warrior, and the music and the music in it, the nuance, the depth, just all of it is just beautiful, just unbelievably beautiful. I think it's more beautiful than anything Carl Jung's written. But yet, Carl Jung's depth psychology is something I simply cannot dispose of. So, like, you just can't get rid of the word archetype anymore, because it explains too much. Its explanatory power has been too great. And so, so you can see how I am ultimately stuck with both of them. And now, happily stuck with both of them. But I can see the weakness in Carl Jung to just assume the best of these Protestants, that they would go with Carl Jung, they'd discard their dogma to rethink, their own religion in more psychological and symbolic terms, archetypal terms, For Carl Jung to think that they would do that, he was basically crazy. Of course they wouldn't, and they didn't. They didn't. But yet, I can understand why Carl Jung wanted to do that, because, well, he was the son of a pastor, and he would naturally want all of his people to come with him on this amazing journey of seeing the Bible, the stories, the symbolism, the everything with new eyes. Because obviously God was dead, in the sense that the old dogmas don't work anymore. But of course, Carl Jung was naive, and the Protestants did not want to come with him. And they did not come with him. And Nietzsche would have been like, if he'd lived to see Carl Jung do that, he would have been like, what are you thinking? Of course they're not going to do that. There's lots of discussions in Zarathustra where Nietzsche's just like, these are walking tombs, these people are poison mixers, poison drinkers. Don't try to save them, don't wake them, let them go. And so that's just the weird paradox of, I think Carl Jung was right, but Nietzsche had more piercing insight into the truth of his contemporaries and how you shouldn't have much hope in them. He was right about that. And Carl Jung was foolish to have as much hope and as much benefit of the doubt as he gave them. Nietzsche was ultimately proven correct to not give them any benefit of the doubt. He was proven correct, tragically. And why do I talk about this? Well, I myself have traversed. I come from this same Protestant background that Nietzsche comes from, very similar anyway, that Carl Jung comes from. Of course, I come from a more modern, evangelical variety, but there's a lot of overlap. And for me to have crossed this bridge from where I was to where I am now, when I look back, it's such a huge crossing. It's really, sometimes it's remarkable that I've come this far, that I can. And so I personally, I love the Bible. I really enjoy it now. I read it all the time. I love the Bible stories. I love all the ancient stories, the stories of antiquity. The person of Jesus always fascinates me. His parables fascinate me. But it's because I've shed the Protestantism from which I've come from. And for a long time, the reason I make this video is because for a long time, I was like Carl Jung. I was wanting to take what I even wrote a book on the Bible. And I think over time, this book on the Bible, which is very respectful of the Bible, but it's not a moralizing book. It's certainly not a Protestant book. It's not an evangelical book, certainly not. And I think over time, it will prove to be an authority on the story of the Bible. I think time will bear that out. Although not being a moralizing book. But I too have wanted to go back to the people who grew up with me in this church world that I came from. A church world that, by the way, was really a lot of fun. I had a lot of great times. I've wanted to go back to the people that I learned from, the many friendships that I had, all the people who, back in the day maybe wondered where I went. I wanted to go back to them, like Carl Jung. I wanted to go back to them and talk about the things I've learned. And I've even tried to do that with some of my ideas, with my book. And man, have I ever realized, like, they're just not interested. They're not. So the extreme paradox is that in the Bible that these people carry around, there is this potential for this grand discovery of this beautiful world of archetypes and symbolism and profound truths about our human condition. And yet, the Protestants who carry the book around, who don't actually ever read it, well, at least you not usually, they have no interest in it. And that was, to me, a hard pill to swallow. And I don't think I had as much grace as, I don't think I've had lately as much grace as like Carl Jung had. He kept holding out the olive branch, and when people spurned him, you know, I think I didn't have as much grace as he did when he was spurned. So I'm making this video ultimately to say this. When it comes to Carl Jung and Nietzsche, there's a lot of overlap. But the reason, though, why Carl Jung always remains important is because of this word archetype. And other words, but archetypes. It's not that the story of the question of did this story, any given particular story in the Bible actually happen, is really kind of just beside the point. Because the story happened in the past. If it happened or if it didn't, it still happens over and over again. It's an ancient type. It repeats. You know, I think about the story of Joseph, for instance, which is very similar to the story of Jesus, which is very similar to the story, by the way, of the Count of Monte Cristo, which I've written about in my book, the comparison between the Count of Monte Cristo and the story of Joseph in the Bible and the story of Jesus. Very similar pattern, you know. But what you have to do before you get into that story is you have to drop all the typical moralizing that is usually associated with the religious institutions that promote the book that contains the archetype. But in order to do that, it's a terrible, bitter pill to swallow to realize that most of the people you would want to share with are going to be extremely prejudiced and bigoted against understanding it, even though they themselves carry around the book that contains the story. So that was a very bitter pill for me. Very, very bitter. But when I'm reading Lawrence Vanderpost talk about Carl Jung in such beautiful prose, just writing like the wind, just like, and it resonated with me on so many different levels. But yet when I'm done reading that, and then I'm, you know, I put Carl Jung aside for a while, and then I go back to Zarathustra. There is this grandeur in Thus Spoke Zarathustra that simply isn't there in Jung. That isn't, there is these heights of glory that only Thus Spoke Zarathustra gets to. These mountain peaks of absolute fucking glory and divinity that only Zarathustra can take you to. And so the position I've come to, and what I encourage people, is to think of Carl Jung as someone who embraced half of Nietzsche, the bottom half. That is the depth psychology of Nietzsche. But he rejected the heights to which Nietzsche flew. And for Carl Jung, I think that was appropriate. But for me, particularly, being the Cancer guy that I am, that is, I was born in July, I'm very schizophrenic in some senses. I love heavy metal music, and I also love beautiful ballads. I love classical, and I love acoustic music. Anyway, it seems in me, Carl Jung was also born around, his birthday is close to mine. So I share a kinship with him in that sense. But I encourage people to consider Carl Jung as someone who did, in fact, embrace Nietzsche, but only the bottom half, the depth psychology. He rejected the heights. And so you can see, to see Carl Jung is extremely valuable, yet insufficient. When one combines Carl Jung with Nietzsche, one gets a very beautiful thing. I guess that's ultimately what I'm saying. One can embrace Carl Jung even in his rejection of Nietzsche's heights, and be grateful for his exploration of Nietzsche's depths, while also taking as a cautionary tale Carl Jung giving too much benefit of the doubt to the Protestants who he was contemporary to. One can see the wisdom of Nietzsche in not really bothering with such a thing. In a sense, in that regard, you really do, tragically, you really do fulfill Jesus' command to not cast pearls before swine. Anyway, if you made it this far, thanks for listening.